October 15th, 1943. Mediterranean Sea, approximately 40 nautical miles southwest of Sardinia. Commander Paolo Bandini stood in the cramped control room of the Adua-class submarine Topazio, watching through his periscope as an American convoy steamed east toward Naples. The autumn Mediterranean stretched endlessly blue-green around them, its surface deceptively calm under the midday sun. The ships moved in perfect formation, 6 Liberty ships, heavy with supplies for the Allied invasion forces, escorted by sleek destroyers whose hulls cut through the blue Mediterranean waters with aggressive efficiency. Through the periscope's narrow field of view, Bandini could see the convoy's disciplined formation. The Liberty ships maintained precise intervals, their grey hulls riding low in the water under the weight of ammunition, fuel, and supplies destined for Allied forces advancing up the Italian peninsula. The destroyer escorts moved like hunting wolves, their radar antennas rotating constantly, their sonar arrays probing the depths for signs of enemy submarines. Everything seemed perfect for an attack. The convoy was positioned exactly where Italian naval intelligence had predicted, following the standard shipping route from Gibraltar to Naples. Topazio carried 12 torpedoes and had successfully evaded British detection for 3 days, threading through the complex underwater terrain of the Western Mediterranean with skill accumulated through 3 years of war. The crew had been at sea for 2 weeks, their beards grown long, their uniforms stained with the inevitable grime of submarine operations. Within 2 hours, Commander Bandini and his 55 crewmen would encounter a weapon they had never heard of, one that would fundamentally alter their understanding of submarine warfare in the Mediterranean. More than that, they would experience the psychological shock of technological obsolescence, the terrifying realization that their skills, their experience, their intimate knowledge of Mediterranean waters meant nothing against an enemy who possessed scientific advantages they couldn't comprehend or counter. The sound would come without warning, 24 metallic impacts striking the water in a precise geometric pattern above their hull, followed by deadly silence. No explosions, no crushing depth-charge detonations that would shake the submarine's hull and fill the crew compartments with terror and noise. Just the terrifying knowledge that the Americans had fired something new, something that only detonated on direct contact with a submarine's hull. Each projectile would settle silently through the water column, waiting with mechanical patience for the slightest touch to trigger devastating explosions. Those who survived would carry a message that spread like wildfire through the remaining Italian submarine force. The Mediterranean was no longer theirs. The ancient sea that had been the highway of Roman legions, the battleground of empires, the training ground where Italian submariners had learned their deadly craft, had become an American hunting preserve where advanced technology trumped skill and experience. The mathematics of this technological revolution were already being written across the world's oceans in statistics that would transform submarine warfare forever. Between 1942 and 1945, British and American depth-charge attacks achieved 85 kills out of 5,174 attacks, a ratio of 60-1. The new American weapon, codenamed Hedgehog, would achieve 47 kills in just 268 attacks, a ratio of less than 6-1. The difference wasn't just numerical. It represented a fundamental shift in how Allied forces hunted submarines, and the psychological impact would prove more devastating than the weapon itself. But the story of this technological revolution begins not with statistics, but with individual men who experienced the transformation firsthand. Men like Paolo Bandini, who had entered the war as a confident hunter and would finish it as a prisoner of forces he couldn't understand. Men like Giuseppe Mariani, whose keen ears had detected enemy ships across thousands of miles of Mediterranean patrols, but who would be helpless against sonar systems that could track his submarine through any maneuver. Men like the 53 other crew members of Topazio, who believed their steel hull and the Mediterranean's depths would protect them from any enemy above. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Italian submarine force that entered World War II in June 1940 was one of Europe's largest and most sophisticated naval arms. The Regia Marina possessed 116 submarines, a fleet second only to the Soviet Union in sheer numbers, ranging from massive ocean-going cruiser submarines capable of circumnavigating the globe to nimble coastal hunters perfectly suited for Mediterranean operations. This submarine fleet represented decades of Italian naval development, incorporating lessons learned from the Great War and refined through extensive training in the complex underwater environment of the Mediterranean basin. The Adua-class boats like Topazio represented the backbone of this formidable force, 650-ton vessels designed specifically for the clear, shallow waters of the Mediterranean. Unlike the massive German U-boats designed for Atlantic operations, or the Soviet submarines built for Arctic conditions, Italian submarines reflected the unique geography and tactical requirements of Mediterranean warfare. The sea's relatively shallow depth, crystal-clear waters, and complex coastline demanded submarines that could operate effectively in conditions where stealth was paramount and escape routes were limited. These submarines were engineering marvels in their own right, products of Italian naval architects who understood the demanding requirements of underwater warfare in enclosed seas. Displacing 650 tons surfaced and 797 tons submerged, they could travel 5,000 miles at 8 knots, with a submerged endurance of 60 hours at 2 knots. Each carried 6 torpedo tubes and 12 torpedoes, plus a 4-inch deck gun for surface actions against merchant vessels. The submarines featured advanced ballast systems designed for the precise depth control required in Mediterranean operations, where thermal layers and varying water density could affect buoyancy unpredictably. The crews were skilled professionals who had trained extensively in Mediterranean conditions and understood their boats intimately. Italian submarine training was among the most rigorous in the world, conducted in the challenging waters off La Spezia and Taranto, where prospective submariners learned to navigate complex underwater terrain, manage the acoustic properties of different water masses, and execute precise attacks in confined waters. The training emphasized psychological as well as technical preparation, recognizing that submarine warfare demanded men capable of operating under extreme stress in claustrophobic conditions for weeks at a time. Commander Paolo Bandini, who would lead Topazio on her final patrol, exemplified the quality of Italian submarine leadership. 38 years old, a graduate of the Italian Naval Academy, Bandini had served aboard submarines for 12 years before receiving his first command. He was considered one of Italy's finest submarine tacticians, a man who understood the subtle interplay of hydrodynamics, acoustics, and human psychology that determined success or failure in underwater warfare. His service record included successful patrols during the Spanish Civil War, where Italian submarines had operated, covertly in support of nationalist forces, and early war missions that had demonstrated his skill at evading British anti-submarine defences. His crews were disciplined, experienced, and confident. They had every reason for confidence. Italian submarines had participated successfully in the Spanish Civil War, conducting covert operations that tested tactics and equipment against real enemies. They had hunted British warships in the early months of the war, achieving notable successes, including the torpedoing of several Royal Navy vessels in the central Mediterranean. They had conducted successful reconnaissance missions throughout the Mediterranean, mapping British defensive positions and convoy routes with intelligence that proved invaluable to Italian and German naval operations. The doctrine that guided Italian submarine operations emphasized stealth, precision attacks, and rapid withdrawal. Unlike German wolfpack tactics that relied on coordinated mass attacks, Italian submarines were taught to operate as individual hunters, approaching targets submerged, firing single torpedoes to avoid detection, and disappearing into the complex underwater terrain of the Mediterranean. This conservative approach reflected both the enclosed nature of the Mediterranean and the Italian Navy's understanding that submarine crews were irreplaceable assets who required careful preservation. The Tactical Manual for Italian Submarine Operations, developed over years of peacetime training and early wartime experience, stressed patience over aggression. Submarine commanders were taught to study their targets carefully, choose optimal attack positions, and execute single torpedo attacks that maximize the probability of hits while minimizing the risk of counterattack. The doctrine assumed that British and Allied anti-submarine defences would remain primitive, relying primarily on visual detection and crude hydrophone equipment that could be evaded by skilled submariners who understood Mediterranean water conditions. This conservative approach had served them well in the war's early stages, when British anti-submarine defences remained primitive and convoy escorts were few. Between June and December 1940, Italian submarines had achieved several spectacular successes, including the sinking of the British cruiser HMS Calypso and several merchant vessels. These early victories seemed to validate Italian submarine doctrine and the quality of Italian submarine crews, creating a confidence that would persist until technological reality forced a devastating reassessment. But by October 1943, everything had changed. The Americans had arrived in force, bringing with them industrial capacity and technological innovations that Italian submarine crews couldn't anticipate. The transformation wasn't merely a matter of numbers, although American shipbuilding capacity was producing destroyer escorts faster than Axis forces could sink them, but of fundamental technological advancement that revolutionized anti-submarine warfare. American destroyer escorts, small, fast warships designed specifically for anti-submarine warfare, had begun appearing in Mediterranean convoys equipped with weapons and detection systems unlike anything Italian submariners had encountered. These vessels represented a new philosophy of naval warfare, one that applied industrial mass production and scientific methodology to the ancient art of hunting submarines. Unlike the converted merchant vessels and aging destroyers that had previously escorted Allied convoys, these purpose-built submarine hunters incorporated the latest developments in radar, sonar, and weapons technology. The destroyer escorts measured 300 feet in length and displaced 1,400 tons, making them smaller than fleet destroyers but larger than corvettes. This size gave them the speed and seaworthiness necessary for convoy escort duty, while allowing them to carry advanced anti-submarine equipment. Their crews were trained specifically for anti-submarine warfare, with specialists in sonar operation, radar tracking, and weapons coordination working together in an integrated system that could track and attack underwater targets with unprecedented precision. The Hedgehog was one of these revolutionary weapons, and its development represented a fundamental departure from traditional thinking about anti-submarine warfare. Developed by the British Royal Navy's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development and improved by American engineers, it solved a critical problem that had plagued anti-submarine forces since the beginning of the war: the dead time between losing sonar contact and the detonation of depth charges. Traditional depth charge attacks required the attacking vessel to pass directly over the submarine's estimated position, dropping explosive canisters that would detonate at preset depths. This approach had several critical flaws. First, the attacking ship lost sonar contact during the final approach, giving the submarine time to take evasive action. Second, depth charges detonated whether they hit anything or not, creating massive underwater explosions that destroyed sonar conditions for minutes afterward. Third, the attacking ship had to estimate the submarine's depth, speed, and direction of travel, introducing multiple opportunities for error. The Hedgehog eliminated these problems through elegant engineering. Instead of dropping explosive canisters over a submarine's estimated position, the Hedgehog fired 24 projectiles in a precise pattern ahead of the attacking ship, while the submarine remained detectable on sonar. The projectiles were launched from Hedgehog Mortars, a British development based on infantry trench mortars that could fire warheads of different sizes using a common propellant charge. Each Hedgehog projectile weighed 65 pounds and carried a 35-pound Torpex, warhead 50% more powerful than conventional TNT. The projectiles were 7 inches in diameter and nearly 4 feet long, giving them the ballistic characteristics necessary for accurate placement at ranges up to 300 yards. They were fired from Hedgehog mortars arranged in 4 rows of 6 on a steerable launcher that could be aimed independently of the ship's heading. The entire salvo could be discharged in under 2 seconds, creating a deadly umbrella of contact-fused explosives, covering an elliptical pattern, approximately 140 feet by 120 feet. The contact fusing was the key innovation that made the Hedgehog so effective. Unlike depth charges that exploded at predetermined depths, Hedgehog projectiles would only detonate when striking a solid object, specifically the hull of a submarine. This meant that misses were silent, preserving sonar conditions and allowing the attacking ship to maintain contact and reposition for additional attacks. Hits, however, were catastrophic. A single Hedgehog projectile detonating against a submarine's pressure hull would punch a hole large enough to cause immediate flooding and probable loss of the vessel. The psychological impact of this technology was as important as its physical effectiveness. Submarine crews had learned to endure traditional depth charge attacks because the explosions, while terrifying, followed predictable patterns. Crews could count detonations, estimate distances, and make informed decisions about evasive maneuvers. The Hedgehog attack was different, a pattern of silent weapons settling through the water, their presence known but their exact positions uncertain, each one capable of instantly destroying the submarine if touched. American naval engineers had also addressed the training and coordination problems that had limited the effectiveness of earlier anti-submarine weapons. The Combat Information Center concept, pioneered by the U.S. Navy, centralized all detection and tracking information in a dedicated compartment where specialists could analyze sonar and radar data, calculate firing solutions, and coordinate attacks with mechanical precision. This systematic approach transformed anti-submarine warfare from an art practiced by experienced sea captains into a science executed by trained specialists using advanced equipment. For Commander Bandini and the crew of Topazio, the first encounter with this technology would begin at 1400 hours on October 15, 1943, with what appeared to be a routine convoy intercept. Lieutenant Giuseppe Mariani, the boat's sonar operator and one of the most experienced hydrophone men in the Italian submarine service, detected the American convoy at a range of 8,000 meters. His trained ears, developed through hundreds of hours listening to the underwater sounds of the Mediterranean, identified the distinctive acoustic signature of multiple merchant vessels and their escorts. Mariani had joined the Regia Marina at 17 and spent 8 years learning the subtle art of underwater acoustics. He could distinguish between the high-speed screws of destroyers and the slower rhythm of merchant vessels, identify specific ship types by their engine signatures, and track multiple contacts simultaneously, using equipment that required extraordinary skill to operate effectively. His hydrophone equipment, while primitive by American standards, was operated by one of the finest practitioners of underwater acoustics in the Mediterranean. The ships were proceeding on course 090 at 12 knots, perfect conditions for a submerged attack. The sea state was calm, with minimal surface noise to interfere with acoustic tracking. The thermal layers were stable, providing predictable underwater conditions that would allow Topazio to approach undetected using techniques perfected over years of Mediterranean operations. The convoy's formation was standard, with merchant vessels in column and escorts positioned for anti-aircraft defense rather than anti-submarine coverage. Bandini ordered Topazio to periscope depth and began his approach, following the tactical procedures that had served Italian submarines successfully throughout the war. The submarine rose slowly from her patrol depth of 100 meters, her ballast tanks precisely adjusted to achieve neutral buoyancy at periscope depth. The ascent required careful coordination between the diving officer, the ballast control operator, and the helmsman, each man performing his role with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had worked together for 2 years. Through his periscope, Bandini could see the convoy in perfect detail against the azure Mediterranean sky. The 6 Liberty ships rode low in the water, their grey hulls marked with the distinctive zigzag camouflage patterns designed to confuse U-boat periscope sightings. The 4 destroyer escorts moved in a loose diamond formation around the merchant vessels, their hulls painted in the distinctive blue-grey camouflage of the United States Navy. Even at 4,000 meters distance, Bandini could see that these ships were different from the British escorts he had encountered previously. The American destroyers' superstructures bristled with new equipment that Bandini didn't recognize. Radar antennae rotated constantly on their masts, sweeping the horizon with electronic eyes that could detect aircraft and surface contacts far beyond visual range. Advanced sonar domes protruded from their hulls, housing acoustic equipment whose capabilities Bandini couldn't imagine. Most ominously, strange launcher assemblies were mounted on their foredeck structures that looked unlike any depth-charge racks or anti-aircraft guns in Bandini's experience. The setup appeared routine, following the attack profile that Italian submarine commanders had executed successfully dozens of times in Dullo's Mediterranean waters. Topazio would close to 2,000 meters, fire 2 torpedoes at the largest Liberty ship, then dive deep and escape during the confusion following the attack. The crew moved through their attack procedure with practiced efficiency, each man performing tasks rehearsed hundreds of times in training and combat. Seaman Carlo Ricci, the bow torpedo room supervisor, reported all tubes ready and flooding complete. The 2 Type G torpedoes in tubes 1 and 2 were armed and set for a depth of 3 meters, calculated to run beneath the target's keel where the explosion would break the ship's back. Chief Petty Officer Antonio Bianchi verified the torpedo data computer settings, ensuring that the weapons would run true to their targets despite the slight sea current detected by the navigation team. At 13:55, with the convoy's leading destroyer bearing 320 degrees at 3,000 meters, Bandini gave the order that would change everything. Fire Tube 1, Fire Tube 2. The submarine shuddered slightly as compressed air expelled the 2 533mm torpedoes from their tubes, sending them racing toward SS Robert Peary, a 7,000-ton Liberty ship loaded with ammunition and supplies for the Allied forces advancing up the Italian peninsula. The torpedoes ran true, their weightless electric motors driving them through the clear Mediterranean water at 45 knots. Lieutenant Mariani tracked their progress through his hydrophones, listening to the high-pitched whine of their contra-rotating propellers as they closed the distance to their target. The attack appeared perfect range, speed, and bearing all calculated correctly using the proven methods that had given Italian submarines their reputation for precision torpedo work. But the convoy's escorts reacted with unprecedented speed and coordination that revealed the revolution in anti-submarine warfare technology. Within 30 seconds of the torpedo launch, every destroyer escort had increased speed and begun an aggressive search pattern. Their reaction wasn't based on visual detection of torpedo wakes or lucky hydrophone contact, but on integrated radar and sonar systems that had detected Topazio's periscope and tracked the torpedo launch with scientific precision. The lead escort, USS Eugene E. Elmore, turned directly toward Topazio's position with her advanced sonar painting precise acoustic pictures of the submarine's location. The destroyer's SQS-4 sonar array, far more sophisticated than anything Italian submariners had encountered, could maintain contact through the maneuvers that had previously allowed submarines to escape. The sonar operator aboard Eugene E. Elmore was looking at a cathode ray tube display that showed Topazio's position, depth, speed, and bearing with mechanical accuracy. What happened next would haunt Italian submarine crews for the remainder of the war and fundamentally alter their understanding of underwater warfare in the modern age. At 14:07, as Topazio attempted to dive to 200 meters and escape using the tactics that had saved Italian submarines countless times before, Lieutenant Mariani reported multiple sonar contacts approaching at high speed. But these weren't the familiar sounds of destroyers conducting random depth-charge attacks. They were the purposeful sounds of hunters who knew exactly where their prey was located. Multiple contacts bearing 085 degrees, range decreasing rapidly, Mariani reported, his voice carrying the first note of uncertainty that his crewmates had ever heard from their expert sonar operator. "Captain, they're maintaining contact through our dive. Their sonar is unlike anything we've encountered." Commander Bandini ordered silent running, shutting down all non-essential systems, reducing speed to bare minimum, hoping to disappear into the acoustic shadow that had saved Italian submarines countless times before. The crew moved through the silent running procedure with practiced efficiency, but for the first time in their experience, their proven techniques seemed inadequate against an enemy who possessed technological advantages they couldn't understand. The Americans maintained contact. Their sonar technology could penetrate the thermal layers and acoustic barriers that had previously provided sanctuary for submarines operating in Mediterranean waters. The SQS-4 sonar array could track Topazio through maneuvers that would have broken contact with earlier British equipment, painting a continuous picture of the submarine's movements that eliminated the guesswork from anti-submarine attacks. Commander Bandini ordered silent running, shutting down all non-essential systems, reducing speed to bare minimum, hoping to disappear into the acoustic shadow that had saved Italian submarines countless times before. But the Americans maintained contact. Their sonar technology could penetrate the thermal layers and acoustic barriers that had previously provided sanctuary. At 14:12, Lieutenant Mariani heard a sound no Italian submariner had experienced before the rapid-fire launching of multiple projectiles from the destroyer above. Not the familiar whistle of falling depth charges, but the distinctive whoop-whoop-whoop of 24 Hedgehog projectiles, arcing through the air and striking the water in a precise geometric pattern. The sound was unlike anything in their experience, mechanical, deliberate, suggesting weapons designed with scientific precision rather than the crude barrel rolling of traditional depth charges. Then, silence. No explosions. No crushing detonations that would normally follow depth charge attacks and shake the submarine's hull like a steel drum. Just the steady ping of American sonar continuing to track Topazio's position with unnerving accuracy, and the subtle sounds of 24 contact-fused projectiles settling through the water column around them. The crew looked at each other with growing confusion and fear. What had the Americans fired? Why weren't the weapons exploding? Had they malfunctioned, or was this something entirely new? Bandini understood first, his tactical experience allowing him to grasp the terrifying implications of the silent attack. The Americans had fired some kind of contact-fused weapon that would only explode if it struck Topazio's hull directly. The pattern above them wasn't a barrage of timed explosives that would detonate harmlessly if they missed it. It was a minefield of sophisticated projectiles, waiting for the slightest contact to detonate with devastating force. Every movement risked triggering an explosion that would tear through the submarine's pressure hull like paper. "All stop," Bandini ordered quietly. "Rig for silent running. No one moves unless absolutely necessary." The crew understood immediately, freezing at their stations as the submarine drifted through the water surrounded by invisible death. The chief of the boat moved through the submarine with hand signals, ensuring that every crew member understood the situation. They were trapped in a three-dimensional minefield, with contact-fused explosives positioned around them in a pattern calculated to destroy their submarine if they moved in any direction. The psychological impact was immediate and overwhelming. Traditional depth charge attacks, while terrifying, followed predictable patterns that experienced submarine crews could anticipate and endure. The explosions were violent but brief, creating massive underwater concussions that would shake the submarine's hull and terrorize the crew, but which could be survived if the submarine was deep enough and the charges didn't score direct hits. Submarines could count explosions, estimate distances, and make calculated decisions about evasive maneuvers based on the attacking ship's apparent tactics. The Hedgehog pattern floating above them was different, a silent, invisible threat that transformed every movement into a potential death sentence. Unlike depth charges that announced their presence with massive explosions, the Hedgehog projectiles gave no indication of their exact positions. The crew knew they were surrounded by deadly weapons, but couldn't determine precisely where those weapons were located or how to avoid them. The silence was more terrifying than the loudest depth charge barrage. For the next 6 hours, USS Eugene E. Elmore maintained contact while systematically repositioning for additional Hedgehog attacks. Each time Topazio attempted to move, the destroyer fired another pattern, creating an expanding field of contact-fused projectiles that forced the submarine deeper and deeper into increasingly desperate positions. The American destroyer demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to the Italian crew, the ability to track their submarine continuously, to position accurately for multiple attacks, and to maintain contact through maneuvers that would have shaken any British escort they had previously encountered. Lieutenant Commander Gerald Conkey, commanding USS Eugene E. Elmore, was executing a textbook anti-submarine attack using the latest American technology and tactics. His combat information center was tracking Topazio on advanced sonar displays that showed the submarine's position, depth, speed, and bearing with unprecedented accuracy. His weapons officer was calculating firing solutions using mechanical computers that eliminated much of the guesswork from anti-submarine attacks. His crew had trained extensively with the Hedgehog system and understood how to use it most effectively against trapped submarines. The American attack demonstrated the systematic application of scientific principles to submarine hunting. Unlike the improvised attacks that had characterized early war anti-submarine operations, this was a coordinated assault using integrated systems, designed specifically to locate, track, and destroy underwater targets. The destroyer's sonar maintained continuous contact, eliminating the dead time that had previously allowed submarines to escape. The Hedgehog system allowed multiple attacks without losing sonar contact, creating cumulative pressure that would eventually force the submarine into an impossible position. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Inside Topazio, the crew endured the psychological torture of prolonged attack by an invisible enemy. The normal sounds of submarine operations, the hum of electric motors, the whisper of air circulation systems, the quiet conversations necessary for coordinating the boat's operation had been replaced by absolute silence, broken only by the steady ping of American sonar and the occasional sound of additional Hedgehog patterns striking the water above them. Chief Petty Officer Antonio Bianchi, a veteran of dozens of depth charge attacks, would later describe the experience as fundamentally different from traditional anti-submarine warfare. With depth charges, you could hear them coming, count the explosions, feel the concussions through the hull. You knew when the attack was over and you had survived. With the American silent weapons, you never knew if you were safe. They could be floating just above your hull, waiting for the slightest movement to trigger destruction. The silence was worse than any explosion. The physiological effects on the crew became apparent after several hours of immobilization. Men who had endured lengthy depth charge attacks without breaking began showing signs of severe stress. The combination of carbon dioxide buildup from restricted air circulation, the psychological pressure of invisible weapons, and the knowledge that they were helpless against an enemy they couldn't fight began to affect crew efficiency and morale in ways that traditional depth charge attacks had never achieved. At 21:45, after 7 hours of relentless pursuit, Topazio's compressed air systems began failing under the strain of extended deep operations. The submarine's life support systems, designed for normal operations rather than prolonged submersion without movement, couldn't maintain air quality for 55 men in a sealed hull without adequate circulation. Carbon dioxide levels rose dangerously, and several crew members began showing symptoms of oxygen deprivation. Commander Bandini faced the choice that would define the final phase of Italian submarine operations: surface and surrender, or continue the desperate underwater game of hide-and-seek against technology his crew couldn't counter. The choice wasn't merely tactical, it was a fundamental acknowledgement that Italian submarines no longer possessed the technological capabilities necessary to operate effectively against American anti-submarine forces. He chose to surface. At 22:03, Topazio broke the surface 400 meters from USS Eugene E. Elmore, her crew emerging to surrender to forces possessing capabilities they couldn't understand or match. As American sailors took them prisoner, the Italian submariners stared at the Hedgehog launcher mounted on the destroyer's foredeck, 24 empty spigots arranged in precise rows like the spines of some mechanical hedgehog, the weapon that had trapped them beneath the Mediterranean without firing a single explosive round. Commander Bandini would later tell American interrogators that the moment he realized Italy had lost the submarine war came not from seeing the advanced equipment aboard the American destroyer, but from understanding the systematic nature of the hunt. The Americans possessed not just superior weapons, but integrated systems that combined radar, sonar, communications, and weapons into a coordinated anti-submarine machine of unprecedented effectiveness. The encounter between Topazio and USS Eugene E. Elmore became a defining moment for the Italian submarine force. Word spread quickly through the remaining boats about the new American weapon that could hunt submarines with scientific precision. Unlike depth charges that exploded at preset depths, whether they hit anything or not, the Hedgehog pattern remained silent until triggered by direct contact, meaning every explosion indicated a confirmed hit. The psychological effect was catastrophic. Italian submarine crews, who had operated with confidence in the Mediterranean's complex underwater terrain, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy who could track their movements continuously and attack with weapons that only exploded when they struck their targets. The old tactics of diving deep and running silent no longer provided sanctuary. Captain Luigi Mascherpa, commanding the submarine Platino during a patrol in November 1943, encountered Hedgehog-equipped American escorts twice within a single week. His after-action report, discovered in Italian naval archives after the war, captured the transformation in submarine crew morale. The Americans hunt us with systematic efficiency that we cannot match. Their sonar maintains contact through maneuvers that would have shaken British destroyers months ago. Their new weapon, we call it the Silent Death, creates patterns of explosives that force us into impossible positions. We are no longer hunters. We have become prey in our own waters. By December 1943, Italian submarine commanders were reporting complete loss of tactical initiative. The Americans had established hunter-killer groups that combined escort carriers with multiple destroyer escorts, creating roving anti-submarine forces that could pursue contacts for hours or days until achieving kills. The mathematical advantage was overwhelming. American industrial capacity produced anti-submarine vessels, faster than Italy could replace lost submarines. The final statistics told the story of technological revolution in warfare. Between June 1940 and September 1943, the Italian submarine force lost 92 of its 116 submarines. In the Mediterranean alone, Italian submarines sank only 21 merchant ships and 13 warships, a total of approximately 100,000 tons. The disparity wasn't just numerical. It represented the complete collapse of Italian submarine effectiveness against Allied anti-submarine technology. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Italian submarine crews who survived the war carried knowledge that would influence naval development for generations. They had experienced firsthand the transformation from traditional depth charge attacks to precision anti-submarine warfare. The Hedgehog represented just one element of this transformation: radar-guided attacks, coordinated hunter-killer groups, and systematic application of scientific principles to submarine hunting had revolutionized underwater warfare. The broader implications extended far beyond the Mediterranean. American anti-submarine techniques developed against Italian submarines were refined and applied against German U-boats in the Atlantic, with devastating effect. The lessons learned hunting in the clear waters of the Mediterranean proved applicable to the deep Atlantic, where American destroyer escorts would eventually achieve kill ratios that exceeded even their Mediterranean successes. For individual Italian submariners, the encounter with American Hedgehog systems represented a personal reckoning with technological reality. Seaman Marco Benedetti, serving aboard the submarine Murena when she was attacked by USS Frederick C. Davis in January 1944, would later write, "We entered the war, believing our boats were invisible beneath the waves. We understood the Mediterranean's waters, its thermal layers, its acoustic shadows. We thought this knowledge made us safe. Then we met the Americans with their strange new weapons. They could see through water itself, track us through any maneuver, attack us with weapons that never missed their targets. We learned that experience meant nothing against superior technology." The technology that defeated Italian submarines continued evolving throughout the war. By 1944, American forces had deployed improved Hedgehog systems, acoustic homing torpedoes, and sonar arrays that could detect submarines at ranges exceeding 5,000 yards. The squid mortar, an even more advanced forward-throwing weapon, could fire 3 full-sized depth charges in precise patterns calculated by mechanical computers. These developments reached their culmination in the Pacific Theater, where USS England used Hedgehog systems to sink 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days during May 1944. The same technological principles that had defeated Italian submarines in the Mediterranean proved equally effective against Japanese forces in the Pacific, confirming that the revolution in anti-submarine warfare was global in scope. The human cost of this technological transformation was enormous. Italian submarine crews suffered casualty rates exceeding 75%, among the highest of any military service in World War II. These men drowned in steel coffins at the bottom of the Mediterranean, victims of weapons and detection systems they couldn't comprehend until too late. Survivors carried memories that shaped post-war naval development. Italian naval engineers who worked on post-war submarine designs emphasized acoustic signature reduction, sonar countermeasures, and deep-diving capabilities, direct responses to the technological shock they had experienced during the war. The Marina Militare submarines of the 1950s and 60s incorporated lessons learned through bitter defeat. The transformation was complete when Italy joined NATO and began operating alongside former enemies. Italian submarine crews trained with American instructors, learned American tactics, used American sonar systems, and operated boats designed with American assistance. The former enemies became allies, united by recognition that technological superiority determined outcomes in modern naval warfare. The encounter between Italian submarines and American Hedgehog systems stands as one of history's clearest examples of how rapidly military technology can shift strategic balance. In 1940, Italian submarines operated with near impunity in the Mediterranean, protected by depth and darkness from primitive enemy detection systems. By 1943, advanced Allied anti-submarine weapons could track submarines continuously and attack them with unprecedented precision. For the men who served in Italian submarines, this technological revolution meant more than tactical defeat. It represented a fundamental psychological transformation. They had entered the war as skilled hunters, confident in their ability to strike and disappear. They finished it as marked prey, constantly detected, perpetually hunted, knowing that the Mediterranean no longer protected them. The sound of Hedgehog projectiles striking the water above their hulls became the audio signature of their obsolescence. Unlike the explosions of depth charges that provided psychological release through noise and violence, the silent Hedgehog pattern represented something more terrifying: precision weapons, waiting in the darkness, patient and deadly, requiring only the slightest contact to unleash destruction. The strategic impact was decisive. Italian submarines, which had been designed to interdict British supply lines to Malta and Egypt, became liabilities that consumed resources without achieving meaningful results. The massive investment in submarine construction and training produced negligible returns against Allied forces equipped with superior detection and weapons technology. Admiral Antonio Legnani, who commanded Italian submarine forces from December 1941 through Italy's surrender, would later acknowledge the technological reality in his post-war memoirs. "We fought with courage and skill, but courage and skill could not overcome the systematic application of scientific principles to anti-submarine warfare. The Americans possessed capabilities we couldn't match, weapons we couldn't counter, and industrial capacity we couldn't compete with." The legacy of those silent Hedgehog patterns echoes still in every submarine that patrols beneath the world's oceans. Modern anti-submarine weapons trace their lineage directly to the technological revolution that began in the Mediterranean. The principles of forward-throwing weapons, contact fusing, and precision guidance systems have evolved into today's sophisticated anti-submarine rockets and torpedoes. Every modern submarine crew understands the lesson that Italian submariners learned so brutally. Technological superiority combined with industrial capacity and scientific innovation proves more decisive than traditional military virtues. The Mediterranean Sea, once a sanctuary where skilled submariners could hunt with impunity, became a proving ground for weapons that transformed naval warfare forever. The story of Italian submarines encountering American Hedgehog mortars is ultimately a story of technological surprise, adaptation, and inevitable defeat. Italian submariners entered the war with justified confidence in their capabilities, and ended it as casualties of a technological revolution they couldn't anticipate or counter. Between those 2 points lay thousands of individual tragedies, men who drowned in steel hulls at the bottom of the Mediterranean, victims of weapons that struck with scientific precision. Their experience, bought with enormous sacrifice, taught the world's navies that underwater warfare had fundamentally changed. Invisibility was no longer assured, detection was always possible. And in that possibility lay the end of submarine sanctuary, as previous generations had known it. The iron coffins that rest on the Mediterranean floor hold the stories of men who learned too late that their underwater domain had been stripped away by science. Their tale stands as testament to a profound truth about modern warfare. Technological advantage trumps traditional military excellence. The American Hedgehog Mortars that hunted Italian submarines proved more decisive than the submarine's torpedo tubes, more effective than the crew's skill, more important than the commander's tactical knowledge. And for the men who experienced those silent patterns falling through the water above their hulls, it was the sound that marked their transition from hunter to hunted, from invisible predator to exposed prey, from confident warriors to victims of technology they could not escape. The Mediterranean was no longer theirs. It belonged to the nation that controlled the technology to master it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.